Blumenthal, I find it so interesting that you didn't bring any of this up during President Biden's administration when he was doing everything to protect Hunter Biden, his son. And I think you just saw what Director Radcliffe just released.
You know, this is an effort to be positive.
If I can finish answering the question, I'm not going to yell over you. I'm not going to get in the gutter with you. But information.
And he has been transparent. In fact, 5 days before the indictment of James Comey, he put this post up as instructions to you. He didn't mince words. He was very open and public that you should indict James Comey and others because they are guilty as hell. No more delay now. 5 days before you indicted, or grand jury at your instructions indicted James Comey.
Senator, I am not going to discuss any conversations I have or have not had with the President of the United
States.
See that you're an
post?
attorney, you have a law degree, and you know that I'm not going to do that. I also find it fascinating, because I'll keep fighting to ensure that law enforcement and the judicial process move forward without political interference.
Did the Attorney General just refuse to answer whether she discussed indictments with the President over dinner at the White House? Senator Blumenthal confronts Pam Bondi with a paper trail of Trump's public demands to prosecute his enemies, and her response reveals everything about where the line between justice and politics has blurred. This is the exchange everyone's talking about.
Mr. Chairman, just so the American people understand, this issue of weaponization of justice goes to the core of the integrity of our criminal justice system. And I think we can all agree that no individual, no group should be targeted simply because they are a political opponent or because the President of the United States has some personal animosity toward them. You've just said that President Trump is the most transparent president in history. Tragically and chillingly, you may be right when it comes to criminal justice, because far from ending weaponization of justice, I would submit, Madam Attorney General, that President Trump has embodied it. And we have a record. It is a public record of his express instructions that certain individuals be investigated. The Attorney General of New York, Tish James, my colleague Adam Schiff, the former CISA director, Chris Krebs, the DHS former Chief of Staff, Miles Taylor. There's a list. And he has been transparent. In fact, 5 days before the indictment of James Comey, he put this post up as instructions to you. He didn't mince words. He was very open and public that you should indict James Comey and others because they are guilty as hell. No more delay now. 5 days before you indicted, or grand jury at your instructions indicted James Comey. I'd like to know from you what conversations you've had with President Trump about the indictment of James Comey.
Senator, I am not going to discuss any conversations I have or have not had with the President of the United States.
See that
you're an attorney, you have a law degree, and you know that I'm not going to do that. I also find it fascinating, because I'll keep fighting to ensure that law enforcement and the judicial process move forward without political interference. No one is above the law, not even the president. That's a quote from you, Senator Blumenthal, in 2017.
Well, let me ask you then, when you saw that
No one is above the law. That was your quote.
When you saw that post, did you talk to anybody in the White House?
I am not going to discuss any conversations I have, nor any investigations,
So
nor
you are unwilling
any
to tell this
pending
committee
cases.
about conversations with the White House
And if I
regarding
may
James
continue,
Comey's indictment.
and if I may
Let me show
continue,
you a picture.
James Comey was indicted by one of the most liberal grand juries in the United States.
The night before James Comey's indictment, you had dinner with the President of the United States. Pretty intimate group.
Actually, there
James
were a lot of
Comey
people there that
discussed-
night. That's
was
a great
James
picture.
Comey discussed at that dinner?
I love that picture. That's a great picture. And there were a lot of people there that night. I think the
Well-
entire cabinet was there.
Did you discuss James Comey with the President of the United States? He was sitting just to your left.
Well, 2 seats down, yes, 2 seats down. And I am not going to discuss any
I'm gonna take
conversations
that
I've
as a
had or not
yes,
have with the
Because
President
the
of the
American
United
public
States.
is entitled to know, Madam Attorney General,
The entire
whether
cabinet
you
was at that dinner.
took
too,
instructions from President Trump after he told you very directly to indict James Comey, which is weaponization of the Department of Justice.
Oh,
You know,
wait.
I want to agree with my colleague, Senator Hawley, that weaponization of our justice system must end. That's the reason that I propose legislation, and I challenge him and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to join me in legislation that would create a statutory right of action for people who are selectively or maliciously prosecuted for political reasons. It would codify your manual, the Department of Justice manual, on political prohibitions against political considerations in charging decisions, and prohibit the White House from intervening, President Trump and any other president from intervening in charging decisions. It would make reforms to the grand jury process. You've just said this grand jury was liberal. We should reform the grand jury process to ensure that the government is not abusing its power and authority, and it will require transparency and accountability reforms at DOJ so that you will and other attorneys general be held accountable for these kinds of decisions. Will you join me in supporting that kind of reform?
Senator Blumenthal, I find it so interesting that you didn't bring any of this up during President Biden's administration when he was doing everything to protect Hunter Biden, his son. And I think you just saw what Director Radcliffe just released.
You know, this is an effort to be
Information.
positive.
If I can finish
and
answering the question, I'm not going to
Attorney
yell
General.
over you. I'm not going to get in the gutter with you. But information that the Biden administration told them not to investigate Hunter Biden's involvement with Ukraine.
Now let's cut through the noise and look at what the actual record reveals. What we just witnessed wasn't simply a partisan back and forth. This was a fundamental clash over the independence of the Justice Department, and both participants came armed with very specific accusations backed by documentary evidence. Senator Blumenthal's central argument rests on a timeline that's difficult to dismiss. He presents what he claims is a pattern. Trump publicly posts on social media that certain individuals, including James Comey, should be indicted. 5 days later, Comey is indicted. The night before that indictment, Attorney General Bondi has dinner with the president. Blumenthal is essentially asking, is this coincidence, or is this coordination? The strength of his argument lies in its simplicity. He's not alleging secret meetings or covert operations. He's pointing to public posts, documented dinners, and subsequent indictments. The timeline creates an appearance that's politically damaging regardless of the underlying truth. But let's examine what he's actually asking for. Blumenthal wants Bondi to confirm or deny conversations with the president about specific prosecutions. This puts her in an impossible position, and she knows it. No attorney general, regardless of party, typically discusses advice given to the president. It's a long-standing practice grounded in executive privilege and the need for candid communication within an administration. However, there's a tension here that Bondi doesn't fully address. While attorney-client privilege might protect general legal advice, the specific question of whether a president directed prosecutions is different. That's not legal advice, that would be evidence of potential obstruction or corruption. Her blanket refusal to answer any questions about any conversations is legally defensible but politically damaging. Now, Bondi's counterattack focuses on Hunter Biden and allegations that the previous administration interfered with investigations to protect the president's son. She references Director Radcliffe's recent disclosures about the Biden administration allegedly instructing officials not to investigate Hunter Biden's Ukraine involvement. This is a classic deflection technique, but it's not without merit as a comparative argument. The problem with her response is that it doesn't actually answer Blumenthal's question. Two wrongs don't make a right. If the Biden administration improperly interfered with investigations, and there are serious questions worth examining there, it doesn't excuse potential interference by the Trump administration. Both can be true simultaneously. What's particularly interesting is Blumenthal's proposed solution. He's offering legislation that would codify restrictions on political considerations in charging decisions, create a statutory cause of action for selective prosecution, and require transparency. This is a smart political move because it forces Republicans to either support the reform or explain why they won't. Senator Hawley, whom Blumenthal references, has also raised concerns about weaponization of justice. If that concern is sincere and bipartisan, then reform legislation should gain bipartisan support. If Republicans don't support it, it suggests the concern about weaponization is selective, only a problem when the other party does it. The grand jury comment is revealing. Bondi describes the grand jury that indicted Comey as one of the most liberal grand juries in the United States. This is a dangerous framing for a sitting attorney general. Grand juries aren't supposed to be liberal or conservative, they're supposed to evaluate evidence. By characterizing it this way, she's suggesting that ideology rather than evidence drove the indictment, which undermines the very legitimacy of the prosecution she oversaw. Let's also address the dinner. Bondi confirms the entire cabinet was present, which on its face makes the dinner seem less suspicious than an intimate one-on-one meeting. But the timing remains problematic. The night before an indictment that the president had publicly demanded, the attorney general dines at the White House. Even if nothing improper occurred, the optics create reasonable questions about independence. What we're seeing here is a broader crisis of institutional trust. The Justice Department's legitimacy depends on public confidence that prosecutions are based on evidence and law, not political considerations. When presidents publicly call for investigations of their enemies, when attorneys general refuse to address whether they discussed those investigations with the president, and when indictments follow shortly after, the appearance of impropriety corrodes that trust. Blumenthal is right that Trump has been unusually transparent about wanting his political opponents investigated. We have the receipts, the social media posts, the public statements. Previous presidents generally maintained at least the appearance of distance from specific prosecutions. Trump has shattered that norm. But Bondi's point about selective outrage has resonance with many Americans. Where was this concern when questions arose about the Hunter Biden laptop investigation? Where were these hearings when allegations emerged about the FBI's handling of investigations into Trump associates? The perceived double standard fuels cynicism across the political spectrum. The fundamental question isn't about whether Trump or Biden is worse. The question is whether we're going to accept a system where the Justice Department operates as an extension of presidential politics, or whether we're going to demand true independence regardless of who occupies the Oval Office. Blumenthal's proposed reforms deserve serious consideration. A statutory cause of action for selective prosecution would give teeth to protections that currently exist only in internal DOJ guidelines. Grand jury reforms could address concerns about both liberal and conservative juries being susceptible to political considerations. Transparency requirements could help restore public confidence. But here's the challenge: neither party has shown much appetite for these reforms when they're in power. It's easy to demand independence when you're in the minority. It's much harder to support constraints on executive authority when your party controls the executive branch. What we're left with after this exchange is a clear illustration of how far we've drifted from the post-Watergate consensus that the Justice Department should operate independently from the White House. Both parties have contributed to this erosion, and both parties have paid lip service to reform while in opposition, only to embrace expanded executive power once in office. The American people deserve better. They deserve a Justice Department that pursues criminals regardless of political affiliation and protects the innocent regardless of political affiliation. Whether we get there depends not on partisan point scoring in hearings like this one, but on whether leaders from both parties are willing to support structural reforms that limit their own power when they're in charge. That's the real test. And based on the historical record, there's little reason for optimism unless public pressure forces change.